So let's come back to that anonymous function thing. Here, I created an anonymous function. We could have assigned a name, as you saw. It doesn't matter here. And I'll come back to what a tiny difference is in a second. But we can also create it like this, because we don't really need the name here. Now, that's one place where you could use anonymous functions, because you store them in a variable, and then the name of the variable is the name by which you call and by which you reference the function, as we're doing it down there when we add the event listener. So that's one thing. But you can also use anonymous functions in places where you don't even store them in variables. And one place would exactly be a scenario like this one, where you add an event listener. You might add an event listener here, and you can do so by defining an anonymous function in place here where you need it. Now, important, this is basically the same as if you define it before and stored it in some variable, and then just reference the variable here. This will not immediately execute the function. Why would it? There are no parentheses after it, which you, by the way, could write. This is valid JavaScript syntax. This would now immediately execute the anonymous function. But this is not what we do here. This is not what we need here. Instead, this just creates a function in place and kind of passes the reference of this anonymous, on-the-fly created function to add event listener. Now, why would we do that? Because maybe we have no other place in our entire code where we ever need that function again. Indeed, that's actually the case for start here. I can comment this out. I will only call it when I click this button here. So I will just move my code, which I had in there, into this anonymous function, and I'm fine. There is nothing wrong with having a separate function. And as you learned in the behind the scenes module, there might even be some memory leak considerations you want to take into account. But if you know you only add an event listener once here, then this doesn't really matter. So there is no way of creating a memory leak here. And then it just saves us some code. And if someone else reads your code, he or she doesn't have to find that function you're referencing here. So if I read that, for example, I have to look where the start function is. There it is. So I don't have to do that if you use an anonymous function. Instead, everything is defined in place here. And by just looking at this line, I fully understand what's going to happen when this button is clicked. So this is a prominent scenario for using an anonymous function. Event listeners, or any use cases where you pass a function, a reference to a function, to another function, which is effectively what we're doing here, right? We're passing a reference to this anonymous function, or before to the start function, to this add event listener function. So this function actually takes a function as an argument, if you think about it like this. Something we'll also have a closer look at in this module. And therefore, this is a great scenario for using such an anonymous function if you never need that same function in any other place in your code. So if I save that and we reload, you will see that works just fine. So I can click this button because my event listener was added with this anonymous function. So why might you still assign a name to this anonymous function though? Because maybe that function throws an error. Let's say here, I'm also trying to log age, which is a variable which just doesn't exist, neither locally in that anonymous function, because of course anonymous functions, just like other functions, have their own local scope. So neither there nor globally, nor in any other file. So age here doesn't work. Side note, name would work because there's a default name global variable available in your script made available by the browser. So don't use name here, but age will not be available. And therefore, if I reload here and I click the button, I get an error. Now, what you'll see is, if you want to find that error, of course, it gives us the line number, so that helps us. But what we don't see here is the name of the function where this problem occurred. Now, since we have the line number, that might not matter, but if you have a huge script and maybe you're even running some automatically optimized version here in the browser where the line number, which is shown here, might not meet the line number you have in your code, then it would be nice to see the function name here, and we don't. Now, that's different if we use a function defined in the old school style, and old school is kind of a dangerous word because it's perfectly fine to use that. But if I would define my function like this, so not storing it in a constant or a variable, but just declaring it like this, and I had the same code in here, and I would then temporarily replace this anonymous function with that, then you will see if we do this, and we therefore encounter the same error, it actually gives us a hint at the function name here. It mentions that this is the start function. On the other hand, when using an anonymous function here, so if I revert all of that, if I use that anonymous function as we did before and we reload and we reproduce this error, Here it says anonymous because, well, that's what it is, an anonymous function. Now we can mitigate this by giving this a name, start game or whatever you want. You can't call this function by that name as you learned. It's not declared and managed globally by JavaScript, but that name is used for debugging, for throwing errors by the browser. So if I now reload this and I produce this, you see start game here. So that's a reason why you might want to give your anonymous functions a name. You don't have to. Obviously, with the line number, we would have found the problematic line as well. But it is worth a thought. And this is why you might still want to assign names to your anonymous functions. Here, I don't really need it because I don't plan on adding this error here. So I'm fine like this. But that's just a tiny additional thing you should know about anonymous functions.